I think it's finally time I write this down. It's haunted me for years, but maybe this will help me move on. I don't know if I can ever forgive myself for what happened that night. I was 15. My girlfriend, her brother, my best friend, and I had come up with the brilliant idea to stay out all night on Halloween. We had the perfect plan. My friend Art and I would tell our parents that we were going to spend the night at Layla's and Will's house. Likewise, Layla would tell her parents that she and Will would be spending the night at my house. I know, it was stupid, but we were confident that our plan would work. I wish the plan had failed. That Halloween night, we set out feeling like total rebels. We decided on a group costume, and each of us dressed up like a DC superhero. Will had dressed as Superman, Art was the Flash, Layla was Supergirl, and I was Batgirl. We were all pumped. We had the whole night to stuff our faces with candy, hang out, and do whatever we wanted to. After we trick-or-treated for about 3 hours, I'm not kidding, people started shutting their doors. By 12, there wasn't a single light or door open. We four were the only people on the street, and with the exception of a barking dog, there was no noise. Layla and I were bored and asked if we should just go home. Will refused. You're at a sleepover at my house, remember? And I'm sleeping at yours. Do you want to be the one to admit to your mom that you lied? Come on, Will, Art spoke up. He'd been eating a lot of candy and was pretty quiet for the last few minutes, like battling a massive stomach ache. This isn't as fun as you said it would be. Maybe it's better that we just went home and told the truth. They'll be mad, but maybe we could still have an actual sleepover. Will looked at each of us and realized that he was the only one that wanted to stay out. He sighed and looked like he was about to relent. Then he looked behind us and his face lit up like a jack-o'-lantern. What's that? He said excitedly, already beginning to move towards it. I turned around. Not 20 feet away was a house that I'd never seen before on our street. It looked like a typical townhouse, but it was covered from porch to chimney with Halloween decorations, and not the cheap plastic ones you see at the dollar store, but the quality, make you want to run decorations that give kids nightmares. There were 2 disturbingly lifelike pumpkin-headed scarecrows guarding the front gate, and over 24 skeletons standing at attention in the front yard. Jack-o'-lanterns dotted the porch, each one with a face frozen in agony. A gigantic spider was perched in the show window, looking like it intended to make the shrub it was hovering over its next meal. Bones were scattered across the roof as if someone had dropped a handful of them from the sky. And for the finishing touch, a spotlight hidden among the shrubbery made the entire house glow an eerie purple. Layla and I glanced at each other. How had we not seen this house earlier? Granted, we hadn't been paying close attention to every house we passed, but still, we'd been all over town. We would have noticed the glowing purple house, right? I turned to ask Art, but he was as entranced as Will. Before I could blink, he was running towards the house too. Once again, I glanced over at Layla. She shrugged her shoulders, as if asking what I expected from 2 Halloween-crazed boys. I grabbed her hand and we ran after them. Up close, the house was even more disturbing. The scarecrows eyed us as we walked through the front gate. I tried not to gag as I passed them. Someone had certainly taken liberties to make the yard believable. Things stank like rotten pumpkins. I gripped Layla's hand a little tighter as we passed the skeletons. They must have been from one of those expensive artisan websites, I thought. They sure didn't look fake. We walked up the porch steps with Will shaking from excitement. Art's eyes were practically glowing, and I remember wondering, half jokingly, if they were in some sort of trance. We rang the doorbell. It was the sound of a church bell and resonated through the house. Trick or treat, we shouted dutifully, although Layla was practically crushing my hand. I was grateful for it. I needed to know that I wasn't the only one who found all of this unsettling. The door was practically thrown open. A gorgeous woman stood in the doorway. She had long legs, thick copper hair that stopped at her shoulders, black eyeliner, and blood-red lipstick. She was dressed in a revealing witch costume and grinned when she saw all four of us. Well, when she saw the boys. My, I didn't expect to be visited by two handsome heroes tonight. She gave a high-pitched giggle. Her voice reminded me of how ladies in old gangster movies talked. Art smiled and thanked her. Will was just staring at her. I took a step closer to Layla. That's when the lady noticed us. I think she knew immediately that we weren't as captivated as the boys were. Not by her house or her beauty. Her eyes glazed over as she saw us, but her smile didn't waver. I noticed then that she was holding a bowl of candy. She slowly extended it to me. Candy, Batgirl? I wrapped both of my arms around Layla and took a step backwards from the lady. I could tell she wanted something, and that it wasn't anything good. No thanks, we've eaten too much candy already. It was a lie. We'd eaten half of her candy throughout the evening. The woman's smile wavered, and she blinked 3 times, as if it was the last thing she expected. I noticed something strange about her eyes. They were kind of cloudy. She turned and offered candy to the boys. Will took a handful, while Art only took 2, obviously still suffering from a stomachache. I glanced again at the candy. The pieces weren't in wrappers, and they didn't look like any brand I had ever seen. It sort of resembled Whoppers, except bigger and lumpier. When the boys had finished their candy, the woman looked at the 4 of us. You must be parched. Why don't you come in and have some apple cider? She gestured to the front door, which stood gaping open like a mouth. Layla physically leaned away from the door. She wouldn't go in there for $1,000, let alone a glass of cider. I agreed with her. I forced a smile. No, thank you. We turned and started going down the porch when I realized that Layla and I were alone. Will and Art were gone, and so was the woman. My heart rate tripled. They went in the house. My stomach hurt. Should we call the police? What could we say? That a pretty lady with a spooky yard had lured 2 boys into her house with apple cider? Even if that didn't sound crazy, we were 2 teenagers out past midnight on Halloween, not exactly what the cops would consider trustworthy. Plus, we didn't have proof that she wanted to hurt the boys. Still, we had to make sure that they were okay. We started walking around the house on the left side. There weren't any windows. This made sense though, it being a townhouse and all. The back of the house had a porch, but the windows and doors were all covered. The right side of the house yielded the same results as the left, leaving us one option: the show window. We maneuvered around the skeletons in the yard and went as close as we dared up to the window. I, being dressed in black and thus harder to see, decided to look through the window, while Layla, dressed in bright red and blue, made sure the lady didn't come out of the house. Before peering in, I took an uneasy glance at the giant spider. Against my better judgment, I touched it. Solid plastic. I sighed and told myself not to be so jumpy. I peered through the window. I was staring at a lit fireplace. It seemed to be the only light source in the room. It was pretty dim in there. Still, I could make out 2 enormous armchairs on either side of the fireplace. I could make out Art's bright red Flash costume, and could see the blue from Will's costume. They were both slumped in the chairs, as if asleep. There was a coffee table between the chairs, holding 2 half-empty glasses of what could only be apple cider. In the center of the room stood the lady. She was standing up straight as a rod, her arms lifeless at her side. Then, with no warning, her right arm shot straight up. She held it there for a second, then let it fall. A second later, she did it again with the other arm. Then, I swear, she started growling. As if it were a signal, Will and Art got up. I could tell that their eyes were closed, but they came right over to her. She put her left index finger on Art's forehead, and her right index finger on Will's forehead, and she began to chant. All 3 of them suddenly began to convulse. Art went down, followed by Will. They started to both kick wildly. Then their kicks became weaker, as if they were losing energy. Then they stopped. I must have made a noise. Layla told me later that tears were streaming down my face. I must have sobbed without knowing it, because the lady turned around. Her eyes were completely blue, with no pupils to be seen. Her mouth was hanging open, with saliva the color of her eyes dripping from her lips, and her face was starting to melt. I screamed. Layla screamed. I shoved myself away from the window and landed flat on my back. The wind was knocked out of me, but I was too scared to care. Layla yanked me to my feet and we just started running. We charged through the skeletons, which I now thoroughly believe were real. As we charged through the gate, I knocked over one of the scarecrows. Its head smashed to bits on the ground, revealing a human skull underneath. We ran, not knowing where we were going, and not caring. We finally ended up in front of my house, and we both collapsed into each other's arms, sobbing. I told my mom everything. At first, she thought I made up the story to get out of lying to her. But one look at our faces, and she knew we were serious. She called the cops immediately. When they investigated the strange house, they made a shocking discovery. It belonged to Miss Smith, who was a woman in her 20s and fit our description. She had been on vacation with her mother in Alabama for the last 2 days. They never found their bodies. Art and Will remain missing to this day. The police don't believe our account of some life-sucking witch. They believe that a child predator drugged them and ran off with them. I don't think Layla and I ever really got over it. We broke up in 12th grade and she and her family moved away for a fresh start. A few months later I moved too. We text now and then, but aren't as close as we used to be. Still, I'm glad I've saved her number for all these years, because tonight I saw something that brought back that traumatic Halloween. A townhouse bathed in purple lights with skeletons set up in the front yard. 2 of them guarding the gate. One dressed in a Superman costume, the other one dressed up as Flash. It was for our own protection. That's what my father said as he meticulously checked each of the 7 locks on the door. Penelope and I watched him curiously from the dark of the living room. His fingers fidgeted with the knobs, toggled the deadbolts, traced the square edges of the new padlock that had been installed with what was almost mistakable as gentleness. The dreary light of the sunset filtered through the windows, catching dust motes and lighting them up with ghostly incandescences before they stirred and settled in the gloom along with our father, his shirt damp and stained, his hair disheveled, his eyes rheumy with a pessimistic, sleepless sort of worry. For weeks, he had been telling us that Halloween was canceled for us, that this year we'd be keeping all the lights off, the doors locked, and the shades down. He said this with a sort of nervous electricity each time, the kind we've seen over and over again as we grew up, the kind our mother had warned us about through her teeth when she finally left him. If his words hadn't convinced us to listen, the way he made himself tall and broad like a wall when he said it had. There'd be no disobeying him on this. The locks, it seemed, were to make sure of that. Still, we could see other children, costumed, and wandering along the streets. I felt Penelope tense as she looked on, and squeezed her hand. Then absently, I scratched the side of my head. "I don't understand why we can't go out there for a bit," Penelope said, her voice high and brittle, like a bell in the silence. "Just a little bit. We could stay right out front, right where you could see us. If anything bad happened, we could come right back." Though she was speaking to him, she didn't turn her head away from the window. Outside, a lanky boy with a jack-o'-lantern for a head and a skeleton suit for his body stopped on the edge of the driveway, stared up at the house, and then shuffled on. "My decision's final," my father replied. "We're staying in today. Lights off, door locked, windows shaded like we said. I need to keep you here and keep you safe, especially with the shit that your mom has been pulling lately." Penelope and I hadn't needed to be told that she was the reason for his worry. In the last week alone, she has driven by a half dozen times and parked her car at the end of the driveway twice without getting out. The one time she did get out, she walked the entire length of the driveway, casting glances over her shoulder and eyeing the house teary-eyed. We could tell by the way her black sedan skewed in the gravel and a look in her eyes that she had been drinking again. It was a surprise that Russell, her longtime boyfriend, or his son, Dane, weren't with her. The front door hadn't budged. She trudged through the overgrowth alongside the house to the back. Our father hadn't known that she still had a key, but the noises she made while trying to come through had been enough to tip him off that she was around again. When she finally managed to put the key in the back door's lock, our father was there to meet her. Without a word, he slammed the door back in her face, sending her scrambling and screaming backwards, then running back to her car while nursing a bloody nose. Now, the back door was tacked permanently shut with 3 heavy 2x4s. It's only a matter of time before your mother or someone caught in her clutches comes back to the house again. She's the one that decided she didn't want to be a part of the family anymore. Who decided that the new life with Russell was more important than us? Neither she nor anyone who shows up in her behalf are coming to talk to you or your sister. The fact that today of all days that she could show up on the doorstep with masks on to hide their judgmental faces and lying mouths should be enough for you to trust me and do as I say. Penelope put her hands to the side of her head and sighed. The red light slicing through the shades and cast her face with a hellish glow, pooling where her wet damp hair pushed up against her fingers. Across the street, a group of miniature princesses shrieked as a spidery, mechanical scarecrow came to life while they reached for the cauldron heaped with candy at the base of their feet. As night flew over our neighborhood, Penelope and I watched the ebb and flow of trick-or-treaters on the street. With the no lights rule our father was enforcing, that meant no television, no computers, no nothing. He briefly suggested that we go upstairs and read, or maybe even that we call it an early night. But the self-same magic that captivated us as we watched the costume figures flit from door to door like buzzing, brightly colored flies refused to let us grow tired. Here was a group of boys dressed up as pirates, some with red and black bandanas, strung with garland around their wiry frames, others with austere tricorn hats, catching the lights with their blade-like edges. There's a group of other girls, high school girls like us, their black dresses hemmed short, their heels rubbing red heat into the cold white of their ankles, as their makeshift coven strode confidently and undoubtedly towards the same Halloween party or another. And with each passing car, I wondered silently if my mother would return tonight, if she would fulfill my father's prophecy and try to steal us away. But the cars never entered our driveway, never slowed as they passed, and Penelope was silent, though I knew her eyes were still following some crowds and cars as mine were. Our father was nowhere to be seen. As midnight approached, the stream of costume visitors to our neighborhood was slowed to a trickle. I could see that the slowing festivities had changed Penelope, that the fewer people that were on the street, the more concrete the fact that we had missed Halloween became to her. With her penchant for bright colors, ghost stories, and her insatiable sweet tooth, it had always been her favorite holiday. Missing it was a huge letdown, but watching it pass had been worse. I put my hand on hers again and squeezed it lightly. "It will be okay, Penelope. There's always next year." She scoffed. "I hate when you say that it would be okay. Whenever you say it, it never is." She bit her bottom lip and then sighed. "And how do you even know that next year will be any different? Dad has always been this way, will always be this way. Afraid of this, that, pissed at Mom or whoever he thinks she's trying to reach out to us through. He throws more fits, slams more cupboards, screams at us more. He's always been there to stop us from moving on or from having fun. It's not fair." I slung my arm around her and pulled her closer. You're right. It's not fair, but hopefully we won't have to deal with this much longer. Besides, He's just trying to protect us, as messed up as his idea of protection might be. He means well enough, even if he's being a little demanding. She shrugged. If you say so. I think I'm done here. I'm gonna head upstairs. I sighed. Okay, I'll follow your lead. We stood up from the couch, and for a moment, I felt spacey and unsteady, as if I was floating far away from my body. But just as I was about to reach out for Penelope to steady myself, we heard the gravel in the driveway crunch, and a white light blast through the shades and illuminate our entire living room. Immediately, we were back at the window. The bloom of light was blinding, especially after spending the entire night shrouded in the indoor darkness. But as my eyes adjusted, I could see the dark stretch of our mom's black sedan. The door swung open, the headlights went black, and the doors closed. 4 figures, vaguely in the same height and width, stood silhouette against the streetlights. "Dad!" Penelope yelled. "Dad, someone's here!" Slowly and purposely, they advanced towards the house. As they approached, we could see that each of them held something. One a crowbar, another pair of bolt cutters, the third had a baseball bat. They climbed the porch stairs, the wood groaning beneath their collective weight. Penelope and I both instinctively stopped panting. Our breaths grew shallow and harsh. We could hear them talking through the wall. "Are you sure this is the place?" "I'm positive," a familiar voice answered. "This is where she said it was. I've been by it before. Are you sure we can have our fun without someone finding out? You sure that there won't be any problems?" "I doubt it," said the familiar voice. "And if there is, there's 4 of us at least." The first voice laughed in response. "Good. Then what are we waiting for? Turn on the lights so we can make this quick." There's a small click of a yellow beam of a box flashlight flared to life. Through the slats in one of the shades, we could see them now. High school boys, all of them. One of them was tall with long, greasy dark hair. Another one stood above the rest, his hair longer and curled, his face pockmarked by acne and scars. The third stood behind them, a ball cap on his head, his hands wrapped around the grip of the baseball bat on his shoulder, as if it was a claymore. The last, the one with the flashlight, we recognized, first by the skeleton suit he was wearing, and then by the sunken eyes and pinched nose. It was Dane. "Come with me now." Our father materialized from the darkness, and I almost screamed. Penelope leaped from the couch, taking his hand, and I followed. As we heard the metal edge of the crowbar being jammed between the door and its frame, our father pushed us down the hall to the kitchen. We passed the back door and stopped at the entrance of the basement. "Listen to me. Don't go down into the basement. Stay at the top of these stairs, and no matter what you hear, don't come out. You hear me?" The door swung open, and we stepped inside. "I don't know what these boys are up to, but your mother must have sent them, and she's not getting her grimy fucking hands on my daughters." The door slammed and the darkness enveloped us. I could feel Penelope shivering next to me as our father locked the door from the other side and walked away. The side of my head began to itch, and I scratched it, anxiously pulling the roots out of my hair. We heard the wood from the front door groan and crack. Seconds later, we heard it slam back into its frame. There was silence and something smashed into the window pane, shattering it into our home. One thump followed, then another, and a third, and a fourth. Footsteps on the wood, the floorboards protesting. Penelope's breath was loud in my ear, her body quaking, her nails digging into my skin. The silence above seemed to stretch on without end, and I wondered where my father was. What was his plan? I wondered if he could stop them. Then the linoleum outside the basement door creaked, and I pulled Penelope close and covered her mouth. The lock slid on the other side, and the doorknob turned. The door swung open, and the 4 boys stood staring at us with half grins on their faces, their grips on their tools tightened. The beam of the box flashlight swung up from the floor until it laid directly on Penelope and me. I felt my breath catch in my throat, my chest heaving as I tried to breathe. My brain was telling me to scream, to cast Penelope down the stairs and throw myself at them, but instead I just stared back at them, the light of the flashlight in my face, my body anticipating what came next. "Here we are," Dane said with a chuckle. "Just what we were looking for." He took a step towards us, closing the space. "We're gonna do this down there?" the greasy boy asked, following close behind. "Where else?" Dane laughed. "This is where it has to happen." He took another step, and then another, until we were eye to eye, our faces almost touching. I could smell a faint hit of chocolate on his breath, could feel his heat radiating from his body. "We're right behind you," one of the other boys said, and starting with Dane, one by one, the boys walked through us into the basement. As if we were no more than a projection, a mist, a mirage, they passed through us, and I felt the walls around me begin to warp and stretch, like I was far away from my body, like I was in two places at once. I turned and locked eyes with Penelope. In my peripherals, I could see the boys canvassing the basement with their light. "This is where he did it," Dane said. "This is where my stepmom's ex-husband shot both his daughters in the head, where he lined them up and used one bullet to kill two girls. A clean shot, temple to temple. And then he hung himself from the rafters with an extension cord. It happened exactly 2 years ago today. And to this day, my stepmom swears that they're still here, in this house, trapped forever because of his actions." I stared at Penelope, and she stared back, and from the darkness our father watched.